Chapter 1. The Son Who Could Handle It. My father put 3 documents on the dining room table before he asked me how my day had been. One was a personal guarantee. One would put my house up as additional collateral for Mercer fleet and logistics. The third would temporarily transfer my management voting authority to my younger brother, Ethan. He was sitting across from me beside our mother, looking exhausted but strangely untouched by the crisis he had created. I stared at the papers, then at my father. What exactly is Ethan putting up? Dad leaned back in his chair. That's not the point, Daniel. It was the answer I should have expected. I was 36 years old, director of operations at the company my grandfather had built, and I had spent most of my life being the son who could handle things. Ethan was the son things happened to. That distinction had shaped our family long before either of us understood it. Dad had called me around 5 that Monday afternoon and told me to come directly to their house in South Charlotte. He said there was a serious problem with our lender. I expected spreadsheets, covenant calculations, maybe a restructuring proposal. Instead, I walked into something that felt more like an intervention. My mother, Linda, barely touched the coffee in front of her. My father, Robert Mercer, had run the company for decades. At 64, he still carried himself like every room was a boardroom. Ethan was 32, our chief growth officer, and the architect of the direct-to-customer expansion that had consumed most of our attention for the previous year. Dad tapped the documents. The bank found covenant irregularities connected to the expansion. They're giving us room to fix it, but they want additional security. How much exposure? Ethan answered before Dad could. It looks worse on paper than it is. Mostly timing issues. Receivables, launch costs, contractor payments. That isn't a number. He rubbed his jaw. Maybe $2 million. I turned toward Dad. How much? He slid a lender schedule toward me. I had spent 13 years studying operational reports. My eyes went directly to the totals. $4.7 million. I looked back at Ethan. You said 2. That's actual operating loss. The rest is contingent exposure. It's still exposure. Dad cut in. We can argue terminology after the company is safe. That was another Mercer family tradition. Whenever Ethan's decisions created a problem, discussing how the problem happened became less important than discussing how I would fix it. I kept reading. The lender wanted more collateral. There were restrictions on future borrowing. There was a management restructuring condition. Then I found the part involving my savings. You want $210,000 from me. We need immediate liquidity, Dad said. That's nearly everything I have outside retirement accounts. Mom finally spoke. You can rebuild. 3 words. She said them gently, as if gentleness changed their meaning. My house in Matthews was worth around $680,000. I had bought it carefully, renovated it slowly, and paid down enough of the mortgage that it represented most of the security I had built outside the company. They wanted that too. I looked at Ethan. He avoided my eyes. What are you contributing? His head came up. My role is different. Apparently, Mom gave me the look she had used since we were kids whenever I was becoming too hard on him. Daniel. I knew what was coming before she said it. Your brother has been under enormous pressure. Ethan had nearly died as a child. A serious heart condition led to surgery when he was young, and afterward my mother lived as though life might demand him back at any moment. When we were children, I understood. When we became adults, the rules never changed. If Ethan struggled, he needed protection. If I struggled, I was strong enough to recover. Dad pushed the restructuring agreement closer. We're bringing Ethan forward as the public face of the recovery. Investors respond to him. He has the relationships. I stared at him. The expansion under his control just created $4.7 million in exposure. And your solution is to give him more authority? Ethan's face tightened. I'm trying to save what I built. What you built? Dad raised one hand. Enough. I looked around the table. Nobody had asked Ethan why the numbers were wrong. Nobody had asked why he had understated the damage by more than half. Nobody had asked why the person whose division created the crisis was being positioned as the man who would lead us out of it. The only question anyone seemed interested in was how much Daniel could absorb. Ethan leaned forward. We have 140 employees. People with mortgages, kids, health insurance. If the lender pulls support, this doesn't just hurt us. That one landed because he knew it would. I knew most of those employees by name. I had hired some of them. I had spent years designing the systems that kept freight moving when storms, labor shortages, vendor failures, and bad contracts threatened delivery schedules. Ethan knew exactly which part of me to aim at. I closed the folder. I'm not signing tonight. Dad's expression hardened. We don't have much time. Then you should have told me sooner. Ethan looked offended. This came together fast. I picked up the lender's schedule again. Several transaction references were listed under consulting and expansion support. One vendor name appeared repeatedly. Blue Cedar Consulting, LLC. I didn't recognize it. That bothered me more than I let anyone see. Dad called after me as I stood. Daniel, this family needs the person who can handle the hard things right now. I stopped for half a second. I had heard versions of that sentence all my life. I took the documents and drove home. Before I went to bed, I opened my laptop, logged into Mercer Fleet's vendor system, and typed 2 words into the search field. Blue Cedar. The results filled the screen. And the first thing I noticed was that someone had been approving its invoices with my name. Subscribe. Chapter 2. One More Sacrifice. I got to headquarters before 7 the next morning. Mercer Fleet occupied a low office complex on the industrial side of Charlotte, close enough to our warehouse operations that I could walk from executive meetings to a loading problem in 5 minutes. That had always suited me. Ethan liked presentations. I liked knowing why a truck had been sitting in Bay 4 for 40 minutes. Blue Cedar Consulting looked legitimate if you didn't ask many questions. It had tax information, a vendor registration, banking details, and invoices describing services with phrases like market integration strategy and regional acquisition support. The descriptions told me almost nothing. The amounts told me more. Payments had increased rapidly during Ethan's expansion. Some invoices had gone through channels I normally reviewed. Others had bypassed operations entirely. I requested the supporting records. Priya Shah, our CFO, appeared at my office door 20 minutes later. Priya was 45 and had the unusual ability to make silence feel like an accounting procedure. You requested Blue Cedar? Yes. She closed the door. Why? Because I don't know who they are. That makes 2 of us. That was the closest Priya came to sounding alarmed. She placed several printed approvals on my desk. Those were attached to payment releases. My name appeared at the bottom. Daniel Mercer. Electronic approval. I stared at the first one. I didn't sign this. Priya's expression did not change. I didn't say you did. How many? I'm still checking. Who bypassed operational review? The requests came through executive-level authority. Whose? She paused. I'm not assigning intent without records. That was Priya. She wouldn't give me an accusation when a ledger would eventually give me a fact. I took copies of documents I was legally entitled to access and left for uptown Charlotte that afternoon. Mara Chen's office overlooked a stretch of downtown that always looked more orderly from 20 floors up. Mara had known me since my grandfather Samuel died. She was 43, a corporate attorney, and one of the independent trustees associated with the founder structure Samuel had created. I handed her the 3 documents Dad had given me. She read them without speaking. When she reached the management proxy, she frowned. What has your family told you this does? That Ethan gets temporary control of my vote while the company restructures. That part is true. And he does not receive your ownership. I already knew that in general terms, but hearing her say it clearly mattered. My grandfather's operating structure gave me 52% of Mercer Fleet's Class A voting units. Dad remained CEO because I had never tried to replace him. I ran operations. He ran the company. Ethan ran growth. The structure had worked because nobody had treated ownership as a weapon. Until now. Mara tapped the proxy. This is drafted more aggressively than I like. If you sign anything, I want explicit language confirming the underlying units remain yours. I also want automatic termination language for fraud, material misrepresentation, and fiduciary misconduct. Dad will say I'm making a family problem adversarial. It became adversarial when someone brought you a document asking for control of 52% of the vote. I looked toward the window. If the lender moves, people lose jobs. That doesn't require you to sign a false confession. There isn't one. Not yet. I looked at her. She held my gaze. Do not sign anything saying you caused losses you didn't cause. I thought about Ethan. When he was 25, I had covered a failed investment he didn't want Dad to know about. A few years later, he mishandled an inventory contract. I spent 6 weeks renegotiating terms so the company didn't eat the entire loss. When Dad considered promoting me to senior vice president, Mom argued Ethan needed a title too, or it would damage his confidence. I waited another year. I had always told myself each sacrifice was temporary. One more correction. One more compromise. One more time being the older brother. By evening, Mara had revised the proxy. The next day, I agreed to contribute my $210,000. I agreed to pledge the Matthews house temporarily as additional security. And I agreed to a 180-day management proxy. I did it for the employees. I did it for the company. I even did some of it for my parents. What I did not do was accept responsibility for Ethan's losses. When we signed, Ethan exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath underwater. He didn't say thank you. He said, "Good. Now we can move forward." The relief on his face bothered me. That night, I took one legitimate purchase authorization from 6 months earlier and placed it beside a blue cedar approval. The electronic signatures looked identical. They should have. The graphic was mine. But years earlier, I had created an internal authorization sequence for high-value purchasing. Every approval made through my account generated a short code tied to the transaction record. My legitimate authorization had one. Blue Cedars did not. I checked another. No code. Then another. Nothing. Someone had not used my approval system. Someone had copied what my signature looked like. I sat alone at my kitchen table with my family's restructuring documents beside me. For the first time, I wondered whether I had just sacrificed nearly everything I owned to rescue a company from a problem that someone was already preparing to blame on me. I decided not to confront Ethan. Not yet. First, I wanted to know where the money went. Chapter 3. My signature, his money. By the third week, Blue Cedar stopped looking like an accounting irregularity and started looking like a story someone had written with me cast as the villain. I used only access I legitimately had as director of operations. No stolen passwords. No hidden hacking. I exported approvals, vendor records, server logs available through our internal audit functions, and historical purchase documents. Then I compared them. Every legitimate approval I had made contained the authorization sequence. Blue Cedar's questionable approvals did not. The metadata gave me something even better. Several documents carrying my electronic signature had been created during a 3-day period when I had been at an industry conference in Atlanta. I pulled my hotel receipt, my conference registration, my calendar. One document had been created at 2:14 in the afternoon while I was sitting on a panel 240 miles away. Priya checked the payment releases. They originated from an executive credential associated with growth. Ethan. I said associated with his division. Priya. She looked at me. I deal in what I can prove. So do I. That earned the smallest nod. I researched Blue Cedar's public registration. The owner was Gavin Pike. I knew the name immediately. Gavin had been Ethan's college roommate. He had come to family cookouts years earlier. I remembered him sleeping on our parents' couch during one Thanksgiving because his flight had been canceled. There was no reasonable world in which I would have hired Gavin's company without remembering it. I followed the money as far as company records allowed. Some payments went to legitimate expansion contractors that were already failing. Ethan had apparently used Blue Cedar to move costs around, so the direct-to-customer program looked healthier than it was. That was bad. Then there were other transactions. A luxury vehicle payment. Private debt tied to an account Ethan controlled. Travel expenses that had nothing to do with regional development. Not all $1.86 million had gone into Ethan's pocket. That almost made it worse. I could see how it had happened. He had made a bad expansion bet. Then he had hidden one loss. Then another. Then he needed a mechanism to move expenses. Then, once the mechanism existed, the line between protecting the business and protecting himself became easier to cross. I still wanted to believe there was some explanation that didn't end with my brother deliberately framing me. So I tested him. I walked into his office late one afternoon. "Do you remember why we hired Blue Cedar?" For half a second, he stopped moving. Then he leaned back. You recommended them. There it was. No hesitation after the first beat. No confusion. You remember that? Sure. You wanted outside support because operations was overloaded. I nodded slowly. Right. He smiled. Why? Cleaning up vendor records. Daniel, now probably isn't the time to go digging through every old decision. We need everyone focused on survival. Everyone. Meaning me. I left. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Don't turn old decisions into new problems. We're finally getting the family through this. I forwarded it to my personal archive. That evening, I drove to Mara's office and gave her copies of the records I had legally preserved. If my access disappears, I said, these can't disappear with it. She read the first few pages. Does your father know? Not yet. Your brother? He just told me I selected Blue Cedar. Did you? No. Mara looked up, then stopped treating this like a disagreement. I went home and kept working. Near midnight, I found a draft internal memorandum inside a folder connected to the restructuring process. It described unauthorized vendor relationships initiated under operational leadership. My leadership. The wording was carefully vague, but the intended conclusion was obvious. What mattered was the creation date. The memo had been drafted 3 days before my father called me to the family meeting. 3 days before they asked for my savings. 3 days before they asked for my house. They had not discovered a crisis and then decided I should help. Someone had been preparing to make me responsible before I ever walked into that dining room. I printed the memo. Then I sat in the dark for several minutes. I kept remembering Ethan as a kid after surgery, pale against a hospital pillow, asking me whether he was going to die. I had been 8. I told him no because older brothers were supposed to know things. For decades after that, I had acted as though the promise still applied. No matter what happened, I would make sure Ethan was okay. I finally understood the problem. Ethan believed it too. The next morning, I put the Blue Cedar registration, metadata, approval records, payment trail, and draft memorandum into one folder. I drove straight to my parents' house. I still believed that once they saw the evidence, they would choose the truth. I had spent 36 years misunderstanding my family. Subscribe. Chapter 4. They chose him. Dad read the documents twice. Mom barely looked at them. I explained the authorization codes first because they were simple. These signatures weren't created through my account. Someone copied the image. Dad stared at the page. You're sure? I built the system. Then I showed him the metadata, the Atlanta conference records, the payments. Finally, Blue Cedar's registration. Gavin Pike? Mom asked. Yes. She looked toward Dad. Ethan's Gavin? That's the one. Her first question was not whether Ethan had framed me. It was, can this be fixed privately? I remember looking at her and thinking I must have misunderstood. Mom, somebody forged my approvals. I understand. No. I don't think you do. Dad called Ethan. He arrived 40 minutes later. When he saw the folder on the table, something in his face changed. I didn't need a confession anymore. Still, he gave us part of one. He admitted hiding expansion losses. He admitted using Blue Cedar to move costs. He insisted most of it had been done to protect the company. The program was going to recover, he said. I needed time. And my signature? He looked at Dad. I used templates that were already in the system. Templates with my name. I wasn't trying to frame you. I slid the draft memo toward him. His eyes dropped. Dad stood and walked toward the window. Mom looked sick. For a few seconds, I thought this was finally the point where the old pattern would break. Then Ethan said, if this gets out, we're finished. Dad turned around. Ethan kept going. The bank will assume executive fraud. Vendors panic. Investors walk. People lose jobs. You forged approvals. I panicked. You built a memo blaming me before anyone asked me for help. I needed a containment plan. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. A containment plan. Mom reached toward me. Daniel, nobody is saying what Ethan did was right. Then what are you saying? She looked at Ethan. He could lose his entire future. I waited. When she didn't continue, I asked, and what do you think I'm losing? Nobody answered. That silence hurt more than Ethan's fraud. Dad eventually sat down again. We need to separate what is fair from what keeps the company alive. No. You want to separate them because fairness is inconvenient. His jaw tightened. We can restructure publicly. You step away over oversight failures. Nothing criminal. Nothing specific. We stabilize the bank relationship, then deal with Ethan internally. You want me to resign. Temporarily. And let everyone think I did this. We won't say that. You won't have to. Mom said my name quietly. I looked at her. You've been telling me my whole life that I'm strong. Do you know what that means in this family? She blinked. It means you think hurting me costs less. That isn't true. Then prove it. I looked at Dad. Tell the board Ethan created the false approvals. He said nothing. Tell the employees I didn't steal company money. Nothing. The next morning, the board met. Dad announced that I was stepping away during the financial review and that Ethan would assume expanded executive responsibility. Because of the 180-day proxy, Ethan could exercise my voting authority in defined management matters. He sat at the table like a man being promoted through a difficult transition instead of a man whose decisions had caused it. Dad's language was careful. There was no direct accusation, just phrases like oversight concerns, vendor authorization failures, and restoring confidence. People filled in the rest themselves. Afterward, I walked through the operations floor. A dispatcher I had hired 6 years earlier suddenly became interested in his screen. 2 managers stopped talking when I passed. Ethan stood near the conference room, speaking to a group of employees. We're going to be transparent, he told them. That word almost made me turn around. I didn't. Before leaving, I returned to the empty boardroom and looked at my parents. One last question. Dad looked tired. Mom looked close to tears. Are either of you going to publicly say, I didn't steal the money? Dad rubbed his forehead. If we start making statements like that, Daniel, it raises questions we cannot afford right now. I nodded. There was nothing left to discuss. I had recorded our private family meeting for my own records. Mara already had the documents. I carried one cardboard box out of the building. By the time I reached my house in Matthews that evening, my corporate credentials had been disabled. For 13 years, Mercer Fleet had consumed most of my waking life. It took less than a minute for a server to tell me I no longer belonged there. Chapter 5. Everything they left me with. Losing a job was one thing. Losing a reputation was different. By the end of the week, 2 people I had known for years stopped returning calls. A recruiter who had once tried to pull me into a national logistics firm agreed to speak with me, but his voice changed the moment I asked about openings. Daniel, off the record, nobody knows what's happening at Mercer. I didn't cause the vendor problem. I'm not saying you did. You're saying everyone thinks I might have. He was quiet. We need the review to settle. That was how reputations disappeared, not through one public conviction, through 50 polite hesitations. My $210,000 was already committed. The lender sent updated collateral notices. My house remained exposed. I walked through it differently after that. The kitchen I had renovated. The back room I had turned into an office. The small deck I had rebuilt myself. It was strange realizing that an asset could be both a home and a number on someone else's risk schedule. Mom called on Thursday. For 1 second, seeing her name made me hope she was finally calling to say she had made a mistake. Instead, she said, "Please don't make this harder for Ethan." I didn't respond. Daniel, what exactly am I doing to him? He's barely sleeping. Your father says the company is under enormous pressure. I'm not at the company anymore. You know what I mean? I did. Even after they removed me, I was apparently responsible for making my removal emotionally comfortable. I have to go. Daniel, please. I ended the call. Mara called an hour later. She had found something worse. Ethan was circulating paperwork suggesting I had voluntarily accepted full responsibility for vendor oversight. The strongest version combined language from different agreements. My real signature appeared on a page I had signed. The responsibility language appeared on a different page. They're constructing a cleaner history, Mara said. Can he get away with it? Not if the originals exist. They do. Because I have them. That was the first reassuring sentence I had heard all week. Then Priya contacted Mara. After my departure, someone had begun changing descriptions attached to several accounting entries. Old expansion expenses were being recategorized. Blue Cedar transactions were being cleaned up. Ethan wasn't just hiding what he had done. He was rewriting what I had done. I drove to Mara's office. Tell me exactly what I own. She opened the founder documents. 52% of the Class A voting units. Still, Daniel, a proxy is not a sale. They keep acting like Ethan controls my shares. He controls your vote temporarily under the proxy. He does not own the units. She showed me the clause she had insisted on adding. Fraud, material misrepresentation, fiduciary misconduct. Any of those, if adequately documented, could terminate the proxy. So we end it. We can. I looked up. But if you challenge now, what happens? I knew the answer. Ethan locks down records. Dad rallies anyone who still believes the family narrative. They call me bitter, unstable, vindictive, the disgraced executive attacking the company because he resents his brother. Mara folded her hands. You have leverage. Leverage and timing are not the same thing. I drove home angry enough to want immediate action. Then I sat in the driveway and thought about Ethan's life. Every time he made a reckless decision, somebody limited the consequence. Usually me. That was why he kept moving forward with such confidence. He had never learned how far a fall could go because I was always beneath him, holding the net. The next morning, I returned to Mara. What happens legally if I leave? Leave where? Anywhere. That depends what you mean. I stop answering my family. I stop appearing publicly. I disappear. She studied me. If you are asking whether an adult can voluntarily leave his family, yes. I'm not filing false insurance claims. Good. No fake death certificate. Good. No estate transfers based on me being dead. Good. If law enforcement starts suspecting someone harmed me, you tell them I left voluntarily. Absolutely. I nodded. I don't need the government to believe I'm dead. Mara understood before I finished. You need Ethan to believe you're never coming back. He keeps taking risks because he believes I'll eventually clean them up. And you want to see what he does when he believes that option is gone. Yes. She leaned back. Then understand the difference between strategy and revenge. If innocent people start taking serious damage, we intervene. Agreed. And you follow the legal boundaries I set. Agreed. I spent the next several days putting ordinary affairs in order and ensuring the records that mattered were protected. Then I drove north. Lake Norman had been part of our childhood. Family weekends. Cheap sandwiches on docks. Ethan refusing to jump into deep water until I went first. I parked near the lake and watched the surface move under a gray sky. I thought about all the times I had gone first so my brother would feel safe. Then I began planning the last time. Chapter 6. The day I died. I didn't want to die. That distinction mattered. I wanted Daniel Mercer, emergency solution to every Mercer family problem, to become unavailable. Before I left, I met Mara one final time. I gave her protected copies of the founder documents, the vendor records, the authorization code history, and a secure archive of operational approvals. I also gave her limited authority to act concerning my ownership if Ethan attempted something that threatened the company. If this starts hurting anyone beyond the business dispute, I told her, you stop it. If law enforcement believes you were abducted, tell them I left voluntarily. If your family tries to declare you legally dead, you challenge anything improper. If there's an insurance claim, there shouldn't be one from me. I'm not taking $1 from pretending to be dead. Mara closed the folder. You're certain? No. That answer seemed to satisfy her more than confidence would have. I removed several irreplaceable family and company documents from my Matthews house. I paid ordinary bills. I didn't empty accounts or create a trail of fraudulent transfers. Then I went to Lake Norman. The weather was unsettled. I left my everyday phone, wallet, and several personal items where they would eventually support the conclusion my family was already emotionally prepared to reach. I took an old small boat onto the lake. I won't pretend I felt fearless. There was a moment when the shore was behind me and gray water stretched around me when I wondered whether I had finally become as reckless as Ethan. But the disappearance itself was not improvised. I had arranged a lawful way to leave the area privately. The boat was later found overturned near a rocky section of shoreline. I was already gone. Search crews looked for me. No body was recovered. My family filled in the missing answer. Within 2 days, Dad and Mom were talking as though hope was a technicality rather than a belief. Ethan gave a public statement outside Mercer Fleet. I watched it from a modest furnished rental outside Asheville. He looked exhausted. I could not tell how much was grief and how much was performance. My brother carried enormous responsibility, he said. The recent pressures around the company weighed heavily on him. That sentence told everyone exactly what Ethan wanted them to believe without directly saying I had caused the financial crisis. Comments appeared online. Former colleagues wrote that they wished they had known how much I was struggling. Vendors posted condolences. People remembered meetings we had attended and turned them into warning signs. Silence became guilt. Stress became confession. My disappearance completed Ethan's story for him. I almost called Mara and told her I was going back. Not because I regretted leaving, because I hated watching a lie become my obituary. Instead, I waited. A memorial gathering was held for employees and family. I watched the live stream on a laptop. Dad spoke first. He looked older. Mom sat in the front row with both hands wrapped around a tissue. For the first time since leaving, guilt hit me hard enough that I had to shut the laptop halfway. I turned it on again because hiding from their reaction did not make my choice more honest. Then Ethan walked to the microphone. He spoke about childhood, about the company, about me. Some of it was probably sincere. That was the hardest part. People rarely hurt you in ways that erase every good thing that came before. Then he said, Daniel gave everything to this company and this family. I stared at the screen. For once, my brother had described me perfectly. I had given my money, my house as collateral, my reputation, my job, my authority, years of patience. And even after all that, they had been preparing to take whatever was left. After the memorial, I received a message through the secure channel Mara, and I had agreed to use. It contained one sentence. Ethan is attempting to convert temporary control into permanent control. I read it twice. My grief did not disappear. It changed shape. Ethan believed I was dead, and within days of mourning me publicly, he was already trying to inherit power he had never owned. Chapter 7. What they did after my funeral. My first response was simple. Stop him. Mara's answer was equally simple. Not yet. I called her through the secure arrangement we had established. He's trying to take my units. He is trying to create a structure that assumes he will eventually control them. That sounds like the same thing. It isn't, and I want him to put his assumptions in writing. I hated how reasonable she sounded. Over the next 3 weeks, Ethan did exactly that. He proposed governance changes designed to consolidate authority. He told Dad the company needed stability after my disappearance. He told Mom that keeping control inside the surviving family leadership was what I would have wanted. I almost admired that sentence. According to Ethan, death had finally made me completely cooperative. Dad supported emergency authority. Mom supported Ethan because she believed he was carrying the burden left by my death. That part hurt. Even from a mountain rental hours away, I could see the pattern repeating. Ethan was suffering, so everyone rushed to protect him. My absence had become another burden he was surviving. Then he began approaching outside investors. One group emerged quickly. Halcyon Ridge Partners. They specialized in distressed private companies. Ethan told them Mercer Fleet had strong fundamentals, but had been held back by operational resistance and outdated internal controls. Operational resistance. Me. Without me there to answer, every weakness became mine, and every future promise became his. The problem was that operations themselves started telling a different story. Late shipments increased. Vendor disputes grew. A major customer complained about inconsistent routing decisions. Ethan had always believed my obsession with process slowed the company down. Now he was learning that boring systems were the reason flashy plans could survive contact with reality. I knew 140 employees were caught inside that lesson. That bothered me more every day. I can return, I told Mara. You can. I could stabilize operations. You could. I waited. Then she asked, and after you rescue everyone? I knew where she was going. Ethan remains in a position to do it again. Correct. She wasn't telling me to let the company burn. She was reminding me that returning too soon would turn my disappearance into another temporary sacrifice. Priya became increasingly important. Ethan pressured her to recategorize several Blue Cedar transactions. She refused. He removed her from some major decisions. She documented every instruction. Then Gavin Pike started getting nervous. According to information Priya passed through counsel, Ethan had told Gavin there was no longer anyone who could connect Blue Cedar to the original approvals. Daniel was gone. That was the phrase. Gone. Then Ethan implied that if regulators ever examined Blue Cedar, Gavin's company would be responsible for whatever improper classifications appeared in its records. Gavin finally understood his role. He was the next Daniel. I told Mara not to approach him yet. Let him decide whether Ethan deserves his loyalty. Meanwhile, I reconstructed the expansion from my preserved records. What I discovered made me angrier than the amount of money. The first misconduct had been small. A bad contractor. A missed projection. A payment moved into the next reporting period. Ethan could have admitted it. Dad would have been furious. The board might have restricted his authority. His career would have survived. Instead, Ethan hid the problem. Then he needed to hide the concealment. Then he needed Blue Cedar. Then he needed my signature. Then he needed me removed. Then he needed me blamed. No single disaster had destroyed him. His refusal to accept the first consequence had created every larger one. By the end of the 11th week, Mara sent me draft transaction documents from Halcyon Ridge. I read them slowly. Ethan intended to use the voting authority he held through my temporary proxy to approve a deal giving Halcyon a controlling economic position in Mercer Fleet. The transaction would bring in enough money to stabilize the immediate crisis. It would also permanently reshape ownership and management. Once it closed, unwinding it would be expensive, public, and complicated. I called Mara. How long? Ethan is pushing for an emergency shareholder meeting. When? Within weeks. I looked through the window of the rental. The mountains were disappearing into evening fog. For weeks, patience had been our strategy. Now patience had an expiration date. We're done waiting, I said. Mara agreed. Chapter 8. The company was never his. The next phase began with documents my grandfather had signed years earlier. Mara spread the founder trust, operating agreement, amendments, and voting schedules across her conference table while I joined remotely. 52%, she said. I had always known the number. What I had never fully understood was why my grandfather had structured it that way. Samuel Mercer loved my father. He trusted Dad to run the company. But Grandpa had also watched both Ethan and me grow up. A letter attached to the founder records explained part of his thinking. He believed businesses failed when authority and responsibility became separated. Dad had authority. I had always accepted responsibility. Grandpa had apparently wanted a mechanism that prevented reckless control from becoming permanent. He put majority Class A voting protection in my hands. I had almost never used it. Exercising it against Dad would have felt like announcing that I considered myself the real owner and him merely an employee. I never wanted that. Ethan had interpreted my restraint differently. He thought I had no power because I did not display it. Mara reviewed the proxy again. Fraud, material misrepresentation, fiduciary misconduct. Each could terminate Ethan's temporary authority if properly established. We have evidence, I said. We need independent evidence. That became the standard. Not Daniel's accusation. Not Ethan's confession at a family table. Not Robert's guilt. Evidence that would survive without any Mercer family member being believed. Priya provided preserved accounting backups through counsel. An independent forensic review compared authentic approvals to Blue Cedar documents. My authorization codes became crucial. Every legitimate high-value approval made through my system generated a transaction-specific sequence. The questioned Blue Cedar authorizations carried the visual image of my signature. They did not carry the sequence. The metadata showed creation patterns inconsistent with my account history. My Atlanta conference records established that I was physically away when several approvals were generated. Bank records connected Blue Cedar payments to expenses controlled by Ethan's side of the business. Then Gavin finally moved. He contacted Priya after Ethan pressured him again. Mara interviewed him with counsel present. Gavin tried minimizing his role at first. He claimed Blue Cedar had simply processed consulting expenses. Then he was shown transaction records. Messages. dates, payment descriptions. His story became more accurate. Ethan had asked him to help create a channel for expansion costs that could not easily appear where lenders would notice them. Gavin knew some descriptions were misleading. Later, Ethan used the arrangement for expenses Gavin had never expected. Gavin had not forged my signature personally, but he knew Ethan was using Blue Cedar to conceal the expansion's condition. Most important, he had messages from Ethan. One referred to keeping Daniel's side attached to approvals. Another, sent after I disappeared, said there was nobody left to challenge the history. Gavin agreed to preserve everything and cooperate. Not because he became noble, because he finally understood Ethan intended to leave him carrying the entire fraud. That was fine with me. Truth did not require pure motives. The forensic reviewer eventually delivered the conclusion I had been waiting for. The records did not support the claim that I authorized the questioned Blue Cedar transactions. The signature images were inconsistent with the company's authenticated approval process. Server and financial evidence supported deliberate falsification. I read the conclusion 3 times. For weeks, I had known what Ethan did. Now I could prove what Ethan did without asking anyone to trust me. Mara called. I'm preparing formal termination of the proxy. Don't serve it yet. You want the meeting? Yes. She was quiet. What do you actually want, Daniel? I knew what she was asking. Not legally. Emotionally. I don't want Ethan destroyed. Then what? I want him unable to keep destroying other people and calling my sacrifice the solution. That was the first time I had said it clearly. Ethan had spent his life assuming consequences were negotiable as long as someone else could pay them. I didn't need him ruined. I needed that system to end. 2 days later, Mercer Fleet issued formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting. Purpose: approve the Halcyon Ridge transaction and confirm permanent executive leadership. Ethan was finally ready to lock in everything he thought my death had given him. I told Mara to prepare the termination notice. Then I told her something else. I'll be there in person. For the first time in almost 10 weeks, I began preparing to become Daniel Mercer again. Chapter 9. They thought they had won. Ethan spent the weeks before the shareholder meeting presenting Halcyon Ridge as a rescue. He appeared in company communications beside Dad. He talked about stability, modernization, a new chapter. Dad praised him for guiding Mercer Fleet through the worst period in its history. Mom started describing him privately as the person carrying the family legacy now. That part came to me through Mara, and I wish she hadn't told me. There are facts you need strategically and facts that simply hurt. Ethan also prepared an announcement naming himself permanent CEO. The Halcyon transaction would give outside investors substantial economic control, but Ethan expected to remain the Mercer face of the company. His confidence rested on one assumption. I could not object. Mara received formal notice and verified my rights. As the actual holder of the Class A units, I had the right to appear. Priya prepared a sealed financial packet. The forensic reviewer finalized a summary. Gavin signed a statement describing Ethan's instructions and their Blue Cedar arrangement. Mara prepared the proxy termination, the challenge to the Halcyon vote, corporate preservation demands, and motions necessary to secure independent control of records. Every piece existed before I returned. That mattered to me. I did not want my comeback to depend on walking into a room and giving the best speech. Speeches could be denied. Documents could be examined. The night before I left Asheville, I considered calling my parents. I imagined Mom answering. I imagined Dad hearing my voice. I imagined the shock. Then I imagined what would happen next. Come home first. Think about your mother. Don't humiliate Ethan. Let's handle this privately. The same family process that had buried the truth the first time would begin again. If I warned them, I would spend the next 12 hours defending my right to tell the truth. I chose the shareholder meeting because it had witnesses, records, counsel, and formal procedures. Nobody would be able to pretend afterward that we had discussed something different. That night, Mara forwarded one final item. A message Ethan had sent to my old number. He apparently still used the conversation as a place to speak to me. I wish you could see this, Dan. Things finally worked out. Dad believes in me now. I'm going to fix the company. I wish it hadn't taken losing you for all of us to figure out where we belonged. I stared at the words. For a few minutes, I was furious. Then the anger faded into something heavier. Ethan really did believe part of what he had written. He had spent his entire life needing proof that he mattered as much as I did. And when he finally thought he had won that proof, I had to be dead for it to feel secure. I did not answer. The next morning, I packed one suit. The original founder records went into a document case. Then I opened the small box containing my grandfather's old Mercer Company pin. I had not worn it in years. I attached it to my jacket. The drive east toward Charlotte felt longer than the drive in a hiding had. I passed familiar exits, familiar truck routes, places where Mercer fleet vehicles regularly stopped. For nearly 3 months, my life had narrowed to one rental, a secure connection to Mara, and the work of reconstructing how my brother had erased me. Now the city came back into view. I didn't go home. I went directly to a private location Mara had arranged near headquarters. The next morning, I entered Mercer Fleet through a side entrance before most meeting participants arrived. Only Mara and a small number of necessary people knew. I heard voices through the corridor. Employees moving. Phones ringing. The ordinary sound of a company continuing after everyone believed I was gone. I stopped outside the boardroom. Inside, Ethan began the emergency shareholder meeting. He had no idea his dead brother was 20 feet away. Chapter 10. Dead men can still vote. Ethan sounded confident. I could hear him through the door. He thanked Halcyon Ridge for its commitment. He thanked Dad for his leadership. He talked about Mercer Fleet's responsibility to move beyond recent tragedy. Then Dad spoke. He mentioned me. He said the family would always honor what I had contributed, but that companies survive by moving forward. That was Mara's cue. She interrupted before the vote. There is a threshold issue concerning the voting proxy being relied upon for this transaction. Ethan responded immediately. The proxy is valid. The underlying holder's authority needs to be recognized. The underlying holder is unavailable. Mara's voice remained level. Not anymore. I opened the door. For all the months I had spent imagining that moment, the reality was quieter. People stopped moving. Mom stared at me as if her mind could not connect my face to the fact of me standing there. Dad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Ethan went pale. Mom stood. Daniel, I wanted to go to her. That instinct survived everything. I didn't. I walked to the empty seat beside Mara and set down my document case. I'm Daniel Mercer. I remain the legal holder of 52% of the Class A voting units. Ethan pushed back from the table. What the hell is this? Mara distributed the notice. This is formal termination of the temporary management proxy based on documented fraud, material misrepresentation, and fiduciary misconduct. Ethan looked at Dad, then at me. You let us think you were dead. Yes. You let Mom bury you. There was no body and no legal death declaration. You disappeared. I did. He pointed at me. And you think you can walk back in here and accuse me? I don't need to accuse you. I opened the forensic packet. The records do. Mara explained the ownership structure. The 180-day proxy never transferred my units. It only permitted Ethan to exercise specified authority temporarily. With the proxy terminated, Ethan could not use my vote to approve the Halcyon transaction. One of the Halcyon representatives immediately asked for a recess. Ethan refused. This is insane. He abandoned the company. I looked at him. That's not evidence that you owned it. Dad finally spoke. Daniel, we need to talk privately. No. His face changed. It was probably the first time in my life I had rejected him in a business setting without qualification. The meeting continues. Priya presented the preserved accounting records. She explained the blue cedar payments. The forensic summary explained the authorization sequence. I showed a legitimate approval and one carrying the copied signature. Same visual signature, different authentication trail. Then came the Atlanta records. I had been physically away when several approvals appeared under my name. Ethan turned toward Priya. You've been working with him? Priya's expression stayed flat. I've been preserving company records. Mara introduced Gavin's signed statement. Ethan laughed bitterly. Gavin is protecting himself. He is, I said. That doesn't make your messages disappear. Mara placed copies on the table. Nobody needed dramatic interpretation. Ethan's own language connected Daniel's side to the approvals and, after my disappearance, stated there was nobody left to challenge the history. Ethan tried another defense. We were saving the company. Then why did personal expenses move through Blue Cedar? He looked at Dad. Dad knew we were restructuring things. Dad's face tightened. I knew you were moving costs. I did not know all of this. I could have used the recording of our family meeting to humiliate both my parents. Instead, I used it only for what mattered. It established that before my resignation, Dad and Mom already knew enough about Ethan's actions to understand that I should not have been presented as responsible. Dad stared at the table. Ethan turned back to me. You're acting like you're some victim after what you did to this family. You disappeared and watched us suffer. I did cause suffering. That answer stopped him. I continued, and I'll carry responsibility for that decision. But my disappearance didn't create Blue Cedar. It didn't copy my signature. It didn't write the memo blaming me before I was asked for help. He had no answer. I moved to suspend Ethan from executive authority, pending independent investigation, and to preserve all company records under neutral control. With my Class A voting authority restored, the motion passed under the governing documents. Halcyon Ridge suspended its transaction. Ethan stared at me. You can't just come back and act like everything belongs to you. I looked around the boardroom. My parents, Priya, Mara, the investors who had nearly purchased control based on Ethan's version of reality. Then I looked at my brother. That's the point, Ethan. It never became yours because I stopped standing in the room. The meeting ended without applause. I didn't want applause. Ethan lost executive authority. The Halcyon deal stopped, and independent investigators finally gained access to records Ethan had controlled for months. Coming back from the dead was the dramatic part. What happened next was slower and far more permanent. Chapter 11. The Price of Being Saved. The investigation lasted months. That was appropriate. Real consequences rarely arrived in one perfect afternoon. The forensic team separated the $4.7 million in losses and liabilities into categories. Some were legitimate business losses from Ethan's failed expansion. Bad judgment was not automatically fraud. Some expenses had been concealed or improperly shifted. Some Blue Cedar transactions were deliberate misclassifications. And some money had been diverted for Ethan's personal benefit. That distinction mattered. I did not want the company telling a cleaner lie just because this time the lie benefited me. Eventually, Mercer Fleet issued a formal statement confirming that I had not authorized the questioned Blue Cedar transactions and that my resignation had occurred during an internal restructuring rather than because of established misconduct. Calls started returning. Vendors who had kept their distance contacted me. Employees who had avoided my eyes apologized. I accepted most apologies without making people beg. They had been given a carefully constructed story. My family had created the conditions for them to believe it. The company itself survived, but not magically. We sold non-essential assets. Expansion stopped. Management cut discretionary spending. The lender restructured obligations after independent controls were installed. It took months to stabilize cash flow. My house was eventually released from the emergency collateral arrangement after refinancing. The day Mara confirmed it, I walked around the Matthews property alone. Nothing looked different. Yet for the first time in months, it felt like mine again. The $210,000 did not suddenly reappear. A portion was formally recognized as a shareholder loan to the company under the restructuring and placed on a repayment schedule. That felt better than some fictional victory where every dollar returned overnight. I had sacrificed the money. Now the company had to acknowledge what it was. Not a gift Ethan had been entitled to. A debt. Dad resigned as CEO. That consequence hit him harder than almost anything else. Mercer Fleet had been the organizing principle of his adult life. Without the title, he looked smaller. During his investigative interview, he admitted he knew Ethan had concealed losses before I resigned. He maintained that he had not understood the full scope of the Blue Cedar scheme. The available evidence supported treating his failures differently from Ethan's. Dad's consequences were corporate and relational. He lost leadership. He lost credibility. And he lost the assumption that being my father automatically gave him access to me. Mom struggled differently. She had protected Ethan for so long that admitting the truth meant questioning decades of behavior she had called love. She came to my house one afternoon after asking permission first. That alone was new. She sat at the kitchen table where I had once compared the forged approvals. I thought I was protecting him because he had already been through so much. I know. Her eyes filled. I kept telling myself you were stronger. I know that too. I didn't understand what I was asking you to carry. I looked at her. I think you understood pieces of it. You just thought I could survive them. She didn't argue. That mattered more than an elaborate apology. Ethan resisted longer. At first he blamed Gavin, then Dad, then the pressure, then me. During one meeting with council present, he looked directly at me and said, "What you did was crueler than anything I did." "You mean disappearing? You let Mom think you were dead." "Yes. You watched our funeral for you. Memorial." "Don't correct me." I let him breathe. Then I said, "I know my decision caused pain. I'm not pretending otherwise." He looked almost surprised. "But that pain doesn't forge my signature for you." His expression hardened. "It always comes back to that. It comes back to what you chose." Later, after the evidence became impossible to outrun, his tone changed. He told me what I had suspected for years. He had always believed Dad respected me more. Even when Dad publicly supported Ethan, Ethan saw who employees came to when something broke. Me. He saw who Grandpa trusted with voting control. Me. He saw every rescue as proof that I was the capable brother, and he was the mistake everyone managed. "I hated needing you," he said. I believed him. I can understand that. He looked hopeful. Understanding had always been the first step toward me solving his problem. Then he asked, "Can you keep this from going any further? The company has influence. Mara knows people. If we settle everything internally," there it was. Even after the apology, even after the investigation, he still wanted the same thing. "Daniel, help me get through this." The evidence left Ethan facing serious legal exposure. Gavin's cooperation, the bank records, the copied approvals, and Ethan's messages made a complete internal burial impossible even if I had wanted one. Eventually, Ethan accepted a negotiated legal resolution. He had to accept formal responsibility. He surrendered substantial personal assets toward restitution. Part of his remaining economic interest was reduced through settlement obligations. He never returned to Mercer Fleet Management. It was not theatrical. Nobody dragged him from a mansion while cameras flashed. His life simply became smaller because the protections that had expanded around him for 32 years were finally gone. Our last difficult conversation happened before the resolution was finalized. He looked tired, actually tired, not presentation tired, not sympathy tired. He said, "I know I don't deserve to ask. I waited, but you're my brother. Help me get through this." For a few seconds, I was 8 years old again. Ethan was in a hospital bed. Mom was crying. Dad was pretending not to be scared. And I was promising my little brother he would be okay. Then I remembered the dining room table. My savings. My house. My signature. My cardboard box. My own memorial. I looked at Ethan. No. He waited for the rest. There wasn't any. No explanation. No compromise. No alternate plan. No promise that I would fix the edges of his consequence. Just no. That was the moment I finally stopped being the son who could handle everything for everyone else. With the legal fight winding down and control of Mercer Fleet firmly back in legitimate hands, I faced one question I had never seriously considered. I finally had the power my family assumed I always wanted. But did I actually want to spend the rest of my life sitting in my father's chair? Chapter 12. The Life They Couldn't Take. A year after I walked back into Mercer Fleet's boardroom, the company looked less exciting than it had under Ethan. I considered that progress. We had no dramatic expansion presentations, no reckless growth targets, no consultants promising to transform an industry in 18 months. Mercer Fleet went back to doing what had made it valuable in the first place: moving freight reliably, protecting customer relationships, maintaining disciplined margins, paying attention to details. Most of the 140 jobs survived. That mattered more to me than becoming CEO. So I didn't. For months, people assumed I would eventually take Dad's old position. I had the ownership. I had the operational experience. I had the credibility after the investigation. Instead, I recruited an experienced executive from outside the family. Someone who did not share our last name. Someone whose employment agreement did not include childhood guilt. I remained chairman during the transition and kept my majority ownership, but I reduced my daily involvement. At first, stepping away felt irresponsible. Then I recognized that feeling. It was the same belief that had trapped me my entire life. If I was capable of carrying something, I assumed I was required to carry it. I wasn't. My shareholder loan began being repaid under formal terms. My Matthews house was fully free of company collateral. For a while, I considered selling it. Every room reminded me of the man I had been before Lake Norman. The man who measured security by how many emergencies he could survive. Instead, I renovated. Not for resale value. Not for family gatherings. Not because Mercer Fleet needed a home office. For myself. It was a small decision, but I liked what it meant. Dad adjusted badly to retirement at first. Then, slowly, he began learning how to speak to me without issuing instructions. We did not become close overnight. There were lunches, occasional phone calls, long stretches without contact. He stopped asking me for corporate updates unless I offered them. Once, months after his resignation, he said, "I think I confused your endurance with permission." I didn't tell him everything was okay. It wasn't. I said, "I think you did too." That was enough. Mom started counseling. She stopped bringing up Ethan's childhood heart condition every time his adult choices came into conversation. That change mattered. His illness had been real. Her fear had been real. Neither one could keep functioning as a lifetime exemption from accountability. I saw my parents occasionally. They asked now. They did not assume. That was the boundary. Ethan remained outside the company. His life was much more modest while he worked through restitution obligations. I heard things occasionally through necessary legal channels. Then less often. Eventually I noticed something surprising. I had stopped wondering what he was doing. For years, I had monitored Ethan almost automatically. Was he struggling? Was he making another risky decision? Did Dad need me to fix something? Did Mom need me to smooth over another argument? Not knowing felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. Several months later, a handwritten letter arrived. Ethan's name was on the return address. I left it unopened for 2 days. When I finally read it, there was no request for money, no legal favor, no demand that I talk to Dad, no argument about Mercer Fleet. He wrote that he still did not understand everything I had done. He was still angry that I let the family believe I was dead. But he also said he finally understood that he had spent years turning my loyalty into a resource he believed belonged to him. He did not ask me to forgive him. That was probably the first truly different thing he had ever done. I put the letter away. I did not answer immediately. Maybe I would someday. Maybe I wouldn't. For the first time, either choice belonged to me. Near the anniversary of my disappearance, I drove back to Lake Norman. I had avoided the place since returning. The weather was clear this time. Families were out near the water. Boats moved across the lake. Nothing about it looked like the place where Daniel Mercer had died. Because, of course, I hadn't. I stood near the shoreline and thought about the version of myself who had come there months earlier. I had been angry, humiliated, afraid. I had believed the only way to stop my family from spending my life was to remove myself from it completely. I understood him, but I was no longer him. I had never wanted my life to end. I had wanted a role to end. The reliable son, the emergency fund, the collateral, the cleaner, the person who could always rebuild, so everyone else could safely destroy what he had. For most of my life, my family called that strength. I didn't anymore. Strength was not proving how much pain I could absorb. Sometimes strength was allowing people to meet the consequences you could have prevented. Sometimes it was saying no and refusing to add an explanation. Sometimes it was loving people without volunteering to be used by them. I reached into my pocket and took out my grandfather's old Mercer Fleet pin. For a second, I thought about throwing it into the lake. That would have made a dramatic ending. It also would have been dishonest. Mercer Fleet was part of my life. My grandfather was part of my life. My father was part of my life. Even Ethan was part of my life. Freedom did not require pretending none of it mattered. It only required understanding that my history did not own my future. I put the pin back in my pocket. Then I walked to my car. A year earlier, I had left Lake Norman hiding from my own name. This time I drove away in daylight. My company was stable. My house was mine. My money was being repaid. My reputation had been restored. My parents had learned that access to me came with boundaries. My brother was finally living with consequences I had not volunteered to carry. And I no longer needed any of them to agree that I had done enough. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going home to fix something for Ethan. I was simply going home, and the life waiting there was mine.